July 1945, Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. The first thing they noticed was the smell. Not the smell of smoke. Not the smell of wet wool uniforms. Not the smell of overcrowded transport ships or prison barracks. This smell was different. Warm. Savory. Strange. It drifted through the humid summer air and curled around the rows of wooden buildings like an invisible hand. The German women stopped walking. Some narrowed their eyes. Others exchanged nervous glances. A few instinctively tightened their grip on the small bundles that contained everything they still owned. The guards kept moving. The women followed. But the smell followed them too. And none of them knew what it was. For months, some for years, they had lived with hunger. Real hunger. The kind that hollowed out cheeks. The kind that made people dream about bread. The kind that turned a single potato into treasure. Across Europe, entire cities were starving. Bombed railways had shattered supply lines. Fields had become battlefields. Food had become a weapon. And now, after surrendering to the Americans, these women found themselves standing in a prisoner-of-war camp thousands of miles from home. The war was over. Or at least, it was ending. But nobody had told their stomachs. The midday sun beat down on the camp roads. Sweat gathered beneath collars. Dust clung to worn shoes. Some of the women still wore faded civilian dresses patched together from scraps. Others wore pieces of military clothing collected during the chaos of retreat. Nothing matched. Nothing looked new. Nothing looked clean. Around them stretched a world that felt impossible. Green grass. Fresh paint. Electric lights. Neat fences. Order. Abundance. America. For years they had heard stories about this country. Most came from propaganda. Americans were supposed to be brutal, arrogant, dangerous. They were the enemy. At least that was what many of these women had been taught. Yet every day they spent in American custody seemed to challenge something they thought they knew. The contradiction gnawed at them. The enemy fed them. The enemy treated illnesses. The enemy handed out blankets. The enemy smiled. Nothing made sense anymore. And then came lunch. A bell rang somewhere in the distance. Metal clanged against metal. Voices echoed across the compound. The women were directed toward a large mess hall. Inside, ceiling fans turned lazily overhead. The air smelled stronger here. Much stronger. A scent unlike anything most of them had encountered before. Cooked meat. Mustard. Fresh bread. Something smoky. Something sweet. Something unmistakably American. The line moved slowly. Women whispered among themselves. What are they serving? Is it sausage? Is it some kind of military ration? No. One woman shook her head. I've never seen anything like it. Neither had anyone else. Ahead, American workers placed long pieces of meat inside soft white rolls. Then they added yellow sauce. Bright yellow. Almost unnatural looking. The food looked simple. But it also looked strange. Very strange. The women stared. Some frowned. Others laughed nervously. A few looked genuinely suspicious. One woman whispered what many were already thinking. Is this really food? Nobody answered. Because nobody knew. The tray reached the first prisoner. She hesitated. The American server smiled and motioned for her to take it. Slowly, she did. Then another woman stepped forward. And another. Within minutes, dozens of German women sat at long wooden tables staring down at identical meals. The room buzzed with uncertainty. Forks hovered. Conversations stopped and started. No one wanted to be the first. Outside, birds chirped in the Georgia heat. Inside, history paused for a moment. A simple hot dog sat between two worlds. To Americans, it was ordinary. A quick meal. Cheap food. Something sold at ball games and street corners. Nothing remarkable. But to these women, it looked almost alien. The bread was too soft. The sausage looked unusual. The mustard seemed alarmingly bright. Everything about it challenged their expectations. And beneath that curiosity lurked something deeper. Fear. War had taught people to distrust unfamiliar things. Especially enemy things. Especially food. Some wondered if it would make them sick. Others worried about appearing foolish. A few simply couldn't believe this much meat could be given away so casually. Back home, entire families fought over scraps. Here, strangers handed out food without asking for anything in return. The contrast felt almost impossible to understand. One woman finally lifted the hot dog. The room seemed to hold its breath. She examined it from every angle. Laughter rippled through nearby tables. Even she smiled. Then came the bite. A small bite. Careful. Tentative. Everyone watched. Her eyes widened. Not dramatically. Not instantly. But enough. Enough that people noticed. Enough that whispers spread. Enough that the women nearest her leaned forward. What does it taste like? She swallowed. Looked down at the food. Then back at the others. For a moment, she seemed unable to find the words. Because what she tasted was more than a meal. It was confusion. Relief. Surprise. And the beginning of a realization that would stay with many of these women long after the war ended. Yet the hot dog itself was only part of the story. The real story had begun years earlier. It began amid bombed cities and collapsing front lines. It began with propaganda, fear, and survival. It began with women who never expected to become prisoners. Women who crossed an ocean carrying assumptions about America that would soon be tested in ways they never imagined. And before they could understand why that strange lunch mattered so much, we need to go back. Back to a Europe in flames. Back to the final months of the Second World War. Back to the long journey that brought these women to an American prison camp, and to a meal they would never forget. To understand why a simple hot dog could leave such a powerful impression, we have to leave the bright Georgia sunshine behind and return to a very different world. A world that smelled of smoke. A world where hunger had become part of daily life. A world collapsing under the weight of war. Germany, autumn 1944. The sound of air raid sirens had become as familiar as church bells. For millions of Germans, the day no longer began with breakfast. It began with listening. Listening for engines. Listening for explosions. Listening for the warning that Allied bombers were approaching once again. In cities across Germany, women spent hours standing in ration lines. Some carried baskets. Some carried children. Most carried worry. The war that many had once believed would bring victory now seemed endless. Store shelves grew emptier every month. Meat became scarce. Fresh fruit became a memory. Coffee was often replaced with substitutes made from roasted grains. Even bread was changing. Loaves became smaller. Ingredients became poorer. Families learned how to stretch every meal as far as possible. And still, it was never enough. One woman later remembered staring at a potato as if it were treasure. Another recalled collecting fallen grain from railway tracks. Children searched fields for anything edible. Nothing was wasted. Nothing. The Germany these women knew was becoming a place of shortages, fear, and uncertainty. But while hunger was spreading, something else was spreading too. Propaganda. For years, German newspapers, radio broadcasts, and officials had painted a picture of America's soldiers. The message was simple. The enemy was dangerous. The enemy could not be trusted. The enemy would show no mercy. Many civilians accepted these claims. Some believed them completely. Others were skeptical. But in wartime, rumors often become stronger than facts. As Allied armies pushed toward Germany from the west and Soviet forces advanced from the east, fear grew rapidly. People whispered stories. Some were true. Many were not. No one knew what would happen if Germany lost. And by late 1944, more and more people understood that defeat was no longer a distant possibility. It was approaching. Fast. The first snow arrived early in some regions. Cold winds swept through damaged streets. Windows shattered by bombing were covered with boards or blankets. Entire neighborhoods carried scars. Brick dust coated sidewalks. Blackened walls stood where homes once stood. At night, city skylines glowed with distant fires. Yet life continued. It had to. Women worked in factories. Women worked on farms. Women repaired roads. Women cared for children and elderly relatives. With so many men serving at the front, women carried enormous responsibilities. Every day brought another challenge. Every day brought another uncertainty. And then came the winter. The winter of 1944 to 1945. For many Germans, it would become one of the hardest periods of the entire war. Coal shortages left homes freezing. Food shortages worsened. Transportation systems struggled. Bombing raids intensified. Across the country, exhaustion became visible everywhere. Faces looked older. Bodies looked thinner. Hope became harder to find. Yet even during these desperate months, few people could imagine how quickly everything would soon unravel. The collapse began like distant thunder. At first, it sounded far away. Reports from the front. Lost territory. Retreating armies. New enemy advances. Then suddenly the thunder was overhead. American forces crossed into German territory. British forces advanced. Canadian troops moved forward. Meanwhile, the Soviet army surged westward with enormous momentum. The war was no longer approaching Germany. It was inside Germany. Entire communities found themselves caught between retreating German forces and advancing Allied armies. Roads became crowded with refugees. Horse carts rolled beside military vehicles. Families carried suitcases. Some carried little more than blankets. The air smelled of mud, fuel, and anxiety. No one knew where safety existed anymore. One former civilian later described the roads as rivers of people. Every direction seemed crowded. Every direction seemed uncertain. And among these masses were thousands of women who would eventually find themselves in Allied custody. Some had worked in military support roles. Others had served in auxiliary organizations. Many were simply civilians caught in the chaos. The distinctions often blurred as Germany's institutions collapsed. As front lines shifted, enormous numbers of people became displaced. Some fled voluntarily. Others had nowhere to go. Many simply followed the crowds. Survival became the only plan. Then came the spring of 1945. And with it came the final act. The sounds of war intensified. Artillery thundered across entire regions. Buildings shook. Windows rattled. Ground trembled beneath distant explosions. The sky often carried a constant growl. For those living through it, the future seemed measured in hours rather than months. Every morning brought new rumors. Berlin had fallen. No, Berlin was still fighting. Hitler was dead. No one knew. The Americans were here. The Soviets were near. Everything changed by the day. Sometimes by the hour. Then suddenly the news became impossible to ignore. Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Officially. But endings are rarely simple. For millions of people, surrender did not immediately bring relief. Questions replaced certainty. What happens now? Who is in charge? Where do we go? What will happen to us? For the women who would later arrive in American camps, these questions felt especially urgent. Many feared imprisonment. Some feared revenge. Others feared they would never see home again. Stories circulated everywhere. One rumor claimed prisoners would be forced into labor indefinitely. Another claimed they would be shipped across oceans. A third insisted Americans treated Germans harshly. Nobody knew what to believe. The uncertainty itself became a burden. Then came the orders. Groups of women were assembled. Names were checked. Possessions were counted. Instructions were given. Some were told they would be transferred. Others learned they would be transported overseas. The reaction was immediate. Overseas? Where? Why? For how long? No one provided clear answers. And when people lack information, imagination fills the gaps. The rumors returned. Worse than before. Some women spent sleepless nights wondering whether they would disappear forever. Others quietly cried. A few tried to remain optimistic. But optimism was difficult when surrounded by uncertainty. Soon they found themselves moving toward ports and transport centers controlled by Allied authorities. The journey itself felt surreal. The war was over. Yet they were still traveling under guard. Still waiting. Still uncertain. At one staging area, women watched American soldiers distributing food. The portions looked enormous compared to what many had received during the final months of the war. Some accepted meals cautiously. Others hesitated. Years of propaganda had left deep impressions. Trust did not appear overnight. Even kindness could feel suspicious. One former prisoner later remembered examining every item she received. Not because she expected poison, but because generosity itself seemed strange. Back home, scarcity had become normal. Here, abundance felt unfamiliar. The contrast created confusion. And confusion created questions. But something even stranger was about to happen. The women soon learned they were being sent across the Atlantic Ocean. To America. The very country they had spent years hearing about. The very country they had been taught to fear. The announcement spread through the group like electricity. America. The word carried enormous weight. Some imagined giant cities. Others imagined prisons. Many imagined danger. Very few imagined what they would actually find. The transport ship waiting at the harbor looked enormous. Its steel hull towered above the water. Gangways stretched toward the docks. Guards directed groups aboard. The smell of salt air mixed with fuel and machinery. Seagulls circled overhead. Engines rumbled somewhere deep within the vessel. Women climbed the gangway carrying bags, blankets, and uncertainty. Each step carried them farther from Europe. Farther from home. Farther from everything familiar. Some looked back toward shore. Some refused. A few silently wiped away tears. No one knew when, or if, they would return. As the ship finally pulled away from the dock, the coastline slowly faded into the distance. Gray water stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The voyage had begun. And before it ended, many of these women would encounter sights, sounds, and experiences that challenged everything they believed about America, including one meal that would become impossible to forget. But first, they had to survive the journey across an ocean still haunted by the shadows of war. The Atlantic Ocean looked endless. Day after day, the same gray horizon stretched in every direction. Water. Nothing else. For many of the German women aboard the transport ship, it was the first time they had ever left Europe. Some had never even seen the ocean before the war. Now they were crossing it. Not as tourists. Not as immigrants. But as prisoners. The ship groaned constantly. Metal plates creaked. Engines vibrated through the floors. The steady thump of machinery echoed through sleeping quarters day and night. At first, many found it impossible to rest. The motion never stopped. Beds swayed. Walls seemed to shift. Stomachs churned. Seasickness spread quickly. The smell below deck became difficult to ignore. Salt water. Diesel fuel. Wet clothing. Soap. Human bodies packed into confined spaces. The air often felt heavy, especially during warm afternoons. Yet compared to what many had experienced during the final months of the war, conditions remained surprisingly orderly. Meals arrived regularly. Water was available. Medical personnel checked on those who became ill. The women noticed these things, and they talked about them. Quietly at first, then more openly, because every day aboard the ship created another contradiction. The enemy was not behaving as expected. One evening, several women gathered near a railing as the sun disappeared into the ocean. Orange light reflected across the water. The sea seemed calm, peaceful, almost unreal. For a few moments, nobody spoke. Then one woman finally voiced a thought many had been carrying. If they hate us so much, why are they treating us this way? No one had an answer. The question lingered in the salty evening air. Because war had taught them one version of reality. Experience was beginning to show them another. Still, suspicion remained. Years of fear do not disappear in a week. Some women remained convinced that harsh treatment awaited them in America. Others worried about forced labor. Others feared indefinite imprisonment. The uncertainty followed them everywhere. And uncertainty has a way of making every small detail feel important. A smile from a guard. An extra piece of bread. A brief conversation. Each interaction became something to analyze. Something to discuss. Something to interpret. Meanwhile, the ocean rolled beneath them. Days turned into weeks. The ship continued westward. And gradually, conversations began changing. Less about fear. More about curiosity. What would America look like? Were the cities really as large as people claimed? Were stores really full of food? Did ordinary Americans truly own automobiles? The stories sounded unbelievable. Yet so had many things they had already witnessed. One afternoon, a young woman stood near the rail watching flying fish leap briefly from the water. An American sailor noticed her fascination. Through broken English and gestures, he explained what they were. The exchange lasted less than a minute. Yet afterward, she spoke about it for days. Not because of the fish. Because of the sailor. He had spoken to her normally. Not as a prisoner. Not as an enemy. Simply as another human being. Such moments were small. But they accumulated. And slowly, assumptions began to crack. Not disappear. Not completely. But crack. Then one morning, a cry spread across the deck. Land! Women rushed toward every available viewpoint. Some climbed onto benches. Others squeezed between railings. Far in the distance, a dark shape emerged from the horizon. America! The excitement surprised even those feeling it. Many had expected only fear. Yet curiosity proved stronger. Hour by hour, the coastline grew larger. Details emerged. Buildings. Harbors. ships, movement, life. The world they had imagined for years was finally appearing before their eyes. And it looked nothing like they expected. As the transport entered harbor, dozens of women stood silently staring. The scale alone felt overwhelming. Massive docks stretched into the distance. Cargo cranes towered overhead. Ships crowded the waterfront. Everything seemed larger, busier, more modern. The smell of the harbor reached them before they disembarked. Salt water, oil, fresh paint, coal smoke, cooking food from nearby facilities. It was a scent unlike anything they had known in Germany. One woman later recalled that even the harbor appeared prosperous. The observation sounded strange. Yet many understood exactly what she meant. After years of destruction, simply seeing infrastructure untouched by war felt astonishing. No bomb craters. No collapsed buildings. No burned-out neighborhoods. No shattered bridges. The absence of destruction was almost shocking. For years, war had dominated every landscape. Now suddenly it was missing. The women noticed immediately. And they kept noticing. When they finally stepped onto American soil, they expected hostility. Instead, they encountered efficiency. Paperwork. Medical examinations. Registration procedures. Instructions. There were guards, certainly. But there was also organization. Predictability. Routine. For people emerging from years of chaos, routine itself felt remarkable. Then came another surprise. Food. Again. And plenty of it. The women stared at portions that seemed almost excessive. Bread. Vegetables. Meat. Fruit. Not every meal was luxurious. Far from it. But compared to late-war Germany, the difference felt enormous. One former prisoner later described feeling guilty while eating. Not because the food tasted bad. Because she knew people back home remained hungry. The contrast weighed heavily. Every bite reminded her of what Europe had become. Yet America seemed untouched by those shortages. At least from her perspective. The realization was difficult to process. Soon the women were placed aboard trains bound for camps farther inland. For many, this became their first close look at the American countryside. The journey itself felt like a moving documentary. Fields stretched endlessly beyond train windows. Farmhouses appeared well-maintained. Roads seemed busy. Towns passed by with astonishing speed. Everything appeared green, abundant, orderly. Even the train stations drew attention. Vending machines, advertisements, bright signs, stacks of products. Products everywhere. One woman stared at a machine filled with bottled drinks. She could hardly believe someone could simply insert a coin and receive a beverage. The concept sounded absurd. Yet there it was. The train continued southward. Mile after mile. State after state. The women watched America unfold outside their windows. And with every passing hour, the gap between expectation and reality widened. But the real surprise had not yet arrived. Eventually, the trains reached prisoner-of-war facilities across the United States. One destination in particular would become unforgettable. Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. Located among rolling hills and green landscapes, the camp seemed worlds away from bombed European cities. Summer heat blanketed the region. Cicadas buzzed constantly. Trees swayed in warm breezes. The smell of pine drifted through the air. For many German prisoners, the climate alone felt exotic. The camp itself operated under established military procedures. Barracks lined orderly roads. Fences marked boundaries. Schedules governed daily life. Yet compared to the devastation many had left behind, conditions appeared surprisingly stable. The women quickly noticed something else. Americans seemed to have food everywhere. The mess hall. Supply depots. Nearby facilities. Even casual conversations often involved food. It became a topic of fascination. One woman reportedly joked that Americans appeared to think about eating every hour. The others laughed. Yet there was truth in the observation. Food occupied a different place in American culture than it did in wartime Germany. In Germany, food had become survival. In America, food could still be enjoyment, comfort, convenience, celebration. The difference would soon become impossible to ignore. As weeks passed, some prisoners began adjusting to camp routines. Others remained cautious. Many continued questioning what they saw. How could a country fight a global war and still appear so prosperous? How could ordinary workers have access to so much? Why were stores full? Why were meals plentiful? The answers involved geography, industry, resources, and wartime production. But from the perspective of these women, it felt almost unbelievable. The evidence sat directly before them. Yet it still seemed difficult to accept. Then one humid afternoon, word spread through the camp. A special meal was being prepared. Nobody knew exactly what that meant. Speculation immediately began. Chicken, sausages, something for an American holiday? The rumors multiplied. As lunchtime approached, the familiar smell started drifting across the camp. At first it was faint, then stronger, then impossible to ignore. Women paused during conversations. Heads turned. Questions spread. The aroma seemed to come from everywhere at once. Cooked meat, fresh bread, spices, something smoky, something completely unfamiliar. Even before they saw the food, curiosity had taken hold. The line outside the mess hall grew longer. Women whispered among themselves, trying to guess, trying to understand, trying to identify the scent. None succeeded, because what awaited them inside was not merely lunch. It was one of America's most recognizable foods, prison camps. Moments when ordinary people discover that reality is more complicated than they were taught. The encounter between German prisoners and an American hot dog may seem insignificant compared to the enormous events of World War II. Yet in many ways, it reveals something essential about the conflict. Wars are fought between nations, but they are experienced by individuals. Individuals who feel fear. Individuals who feel hunger. Individuals who make assumptions. Individuals who sometimes discover they were wrong. The women who arrived in America carried years of expectations. Some expected cruelty. Some expected humiliation. Some expected hatred. Instead, they encountered something far more confusing. Humanity. Not perfect humanity. Not flawless humanity. But humanity nonetheless. That does not erase the suffering of the war. It does not erase destruction. It does not erase loss. Millions died. Entire cities were devastated. Families were torn apart across continents. Nothing can undo those realities. But stories like this remind us that even during history's darkest moments, human beings remain capable of surprising one another. A meal shared across enemy lines. A conversation between strangers. A simple act of dignity. These moments rarely make headlines. Yet they often leave the deepest impressions. Perhaps that is why so many wartime memories involve ordinary things. A piece of bread. A cup of coffee. A letter from home. Or a strange-looking American hot dog sitting on a tray in a Georgia mess hall. Because in those small moments, people glimpse something larger. They glimpse the possibility that enemies are not always a food so ordinary to Americans that few thought twice about it. Yet to these German women, it looked like something from another world. And the moment they first laid eyes on it would trigger confusion, laughter, suspicion, and ultimately a memory many would carry for the rest of their lives. The famous hot dog encounter was finally about to begin. The laughter started quietly. At first, it was just a few women smiling at one another across the mess hall tables. Then came the questions. What exactly is this? Why is the sausage inside the bread? Why is the mustard so yellow? The room filled with curiosity. Some took cautious bites. Others examined the hot dogs from every angle before finally tasting them. A few decided they liked them immediately. Others weren't so sure. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. They had never eaten anything quite like it. To the American staff serving lunch that day, the scene may have seemed ordinary. Perhaps even amusing. But for the German women sitting in that mess hall, the moment carried a meaning far larger than the food itself. Because the hot dog represented something unexpected. It represented a world they had been told did not exist. For years they had heard stories about America. Some were exaggerated. Some were false. Some were designed to create fear. Yet now they were experiencing the reality for themselves. And reality was proving far more complicated than propaganda. The enemy was not behaving like the enemy they had imagined. That realization was not immediate. It did not happen because of one meal, or one conversation, or one act of kindness. It happened gradually, piece by piece, day by day. The hot dog simply became one small chapter in a much larger transformation. As weeks turned into months, many of the women settled into camp routines. They worked. They studied. They attended classes. Some learned English. Others participated in recreational activities organized by camp authorities. Life remained restricted. They were still prisoners. They still missed home. They still worried about family members scattered across a shattered Europe. But many also found themselves confronting uncomfortable truths. The world was not as simple as they had once believed. War rarely is. The same conflict that had separated nations had also connected ordinary people in unexpected ways. American guards spoke about their families. German prisoners spoke about theirs. Both sides had lost loved ones. Both sides carried scars. Both sides wanted the war to end. Those shared experiences mattered. They revealed something propaganda often hides. Human beings are usually more similar than governments would like them to believe. Eventually, repatriation programs began. The process was slow. Europe remained devastated. Transportation networks needed rebuilding. Entire governments were being reorganized. Millions of displaced people required assistance. The scale of the challenge was enormous. Yet little by little, prisoners began returning home. For many of the German women, the journey back was emotional. Some returned to cities they barely recognized. Entire neighborhoods had vanished. Factories lay in ruins. Railway stations were damaged. Church towers stood alone amid fields of rubble. The Germany they remembered no longer existed. Families searched for missing relatives. Friends discovered who had survived and who had not. The war's consequences appeared everywhere. In broken buildings. In empty chairs at dinner tables. In photographs of people who never came home. Rebuilding would take years. For some communities, decades. Yet amid that destruction, many former prisoners carried unexpected memories from America. Memories of clean barracks. Memories of regular meals. Memories of conversations with former enemies. And yes, memories of their first hot dog. Years later, some women would laugh when recalling the experience. Not because the food itself was extraordinary, but because of what it symbolized. A moment of surprise. A moment when expectation collided with reality. A moment when certainty gave way to curiosity. Historians often focus on battles, generals, weapons, political leaders. And those stories matter. They shaped the course of the 20th century. But history is also made of smaller moments. Moments inside train stations. Moments around dinner tables. Moments in what they seem. That fear can give way to understanding. That assumptions can be challenged. And that even after years of violence, individuals can still recognize one another as human beings. The women who took those first cautious bites could not have known they were participating in a story that would still be discussed generations later. To them, it was simply lunch. Yet history often hides itself inside ordinary moments. A hot dog. A question. A laugh. A memory. And behind them all, a lesson that remains just as relevant today as it was in 1945. The lesson that understanding often begins when we are willing to look beyond what we have been told. The lesson that truth is rarely simple. And the lesson that even after the most devastating wars in human history, small acts of humanity can still leave a lasting mark. Because long after the battles end, long after the armies disappear, long after the headlines fade, people remember how they were treated. And sometimes, they remember something as simple as the first meal that changed the way they saw the world. If you enjoyed this hidden World War II story, please like, subscribe, and join us for more forgotten stories from history.